Welcome to Guilty Pleasure Stories channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. For years I believed my father was my protector. I thought he was the person who would always stand by me, shielding me from the worst life could throw my way. Fathers are meant to be that, right? A shield, a guide, someone who loves you without conditions or expectations. At least that's what I told myself every time I looked at him. But the truth was darker than anything I could have imagined. Over time, the person I trusted most became the one I feared waking up to every morning. That shift didn't happen all at once. It came in fragments, moments that looking back were always building towards something I couldn't stop. I still remember the day it all began. The day I stopped feeling safe in my own home. My world had already been torn apart by my mother's death. She was my rock, the kind of woman whose presence filled every room she walked into. Her absence was like a void, swallowing everything I thought I knew. And just when I thought life couldn't break me any further, my dad found a way to make sure it did. I wish I could say I saw it coming, that there were signs or warning lights flashing, but there weren't. One moment I was a grieving teenager holding on to my dad as the only family I had left, and the next I was something else entirely, something I didn't recognize. This is my story. A story of betrayal. A story of survival. A story of finding my voice in the face of everything that tried to silence it. My name is Hazel Warner. Growing up, my life felt like it could have been anyone's. A mix of small joys, routine days, and the kind of comfort you take for granted until it's gone. My mom, Isla, was the heart of our family. She was the kind of person who remembered every little thing about you. What made you laugh? What made you cry? What you loved for breakfast on your worst days. She had this laugh that could brighten even the darkest of rooms. For as long as I can remember, she was my safe place. My dad, Jackson Abbott, was quieter, not cold, but reserved, like he was always carrying some invisible weight. But he loved us. At least, that's what I believe. Things weren't perfect. No family is, but I always thought I was lucky. We had Sunday movie nights where we'd pile onto the couch and lose track of time. Mom would make popcorn, always slightly burnt, but somehow still delicious. Dad would sit next to her, his arm draped casually over her shoulders. It was the picture of normalcy. A picture that in hindsight was fragile in ways I couldn't see. Then everything changed when my mom got sick. It wasn't one of those sudden illnesses you hear about on TV. It was long drawn out and cruel. Watching her fade away over months felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing there was no way to pull her back. I was only 14, but in some ways I grew up overnight. I tried to be strong for her, for us, but when she passed, something inside me broke. The world felt colder, emptier. It was like a light had gone out, and I didn't know how to find my way back. Dad changed too. At first I thought it was grief. Losing the person you've shared a life with can shatter anyone. He stopped going to work regularly, spent more time at home, and spoke less and less. His hugs became tighter, longer, like he was holding on to the last piece of something he couldn't afford to lose. It seemed almost sweet at the time, even comforting. I thought we were leaning on each other to get through the worst days of our lives. But grief doesn't always bring people together. Sometimes it warps them. And as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice cracks in the father. I thought I knew he wasn't just distant. He was different. His gaze lingered too long, his touches fell off. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, because everything already felt so wrong. I wanted so badly to believe he was just trying to protect me, just like I'd always believed he would. Looking back now, I wish I'd listened to the voice in my head telling me something wasn't right. But at 15, grieving and alone, it's easier to silence that voice than face what it's trying to tell you. And so I did. Before we continue, don't forget to share this video, like it, and subscribe for more content that sheds light on difficult stories and important conversations. It started on a quiet evening, just the of us. The house felt heavier than ever, silent in a way that made you hyper-aware of every little sound. The creak of the couch as you shifted your weight, the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, even the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. We were sitting in the living room, a place that used to feel warm and alive, but now felt like a hollow shell. The TV was on, but I wasn't watching it. I don't think he was either. It was just background noise, a distraction from the absence that loomed over us both. "You look so much like her," he said. Out of nowhere, his voice was low, almost tender. I turned to face him, confused. My mom had always been beautiful, people said. I had her eyes, her smile, but I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. I just offered a small, awkward smile and looked back at the TV, hoping the moment would pass, but it didn't. Instead, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. It was such a simple gesture, one that could have been innocent in another context. But it didn't feel innocent. His hand lingered for a second too long. My body stiffened and I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something was wrong. I wanted to move, to stand up, to say something, but I couldn't. It was like my brain and body had disconnected, leaving me frozen in place. "You're so beautiful," he said, his hand now resting on my shoulder. The words hung in the air, suffocating me. Before I could process what was happening, his hand slid lower, brushing against my ***T. Panic surged through me, but it was buried beneath layers of disbelief. This was my dad. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. When his hand moved to my thigh, I finally snapped out of my daze. "Dad, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaky, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he pressed a finger to his L***SS, as if to shush me, and leaned in closer. The room felt like it was spinning. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. I wanted to scream, to push him away, but my body refused to cooperate. It was like every muscle had locked up in fear. The next few moments passed in a blur. I remember him pulling me to the floor, his weight pinning me down. I remember the sharp pain and the tears streaming down my face. But more than anything, I remember the silence, not from him. He muttered things I couldn't comprehend. But from me, I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I just lay there, frozen, tears soaking the carpet beneath me. When it was over, he stood up and walked away without a word, leaving me crumpled on the floor. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too stunned to move. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. How had this happened? Why had this happened? And why hadn't I stopped it? That night I locked myself in my room and cried until there were no tears left. But the worst part wasn't the pain or the betrayal. It was the guilt. A small, insidious voice in my head kept whispering that this was my fault, that I'd done something to invite it, even though I didn't know what that after that night. I didn't leave my room for a week. I couldn't. The walls of my room felt like the only barrier between me and the world outside, a world that now felt foreign, dangerous, and suffocating. I skipped meals, ignored my dad's calls through the door, and buried myself under the covers, as if hiding could somehow erase what had happened. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on the floor, hearing his voice, feeling his weight. I didn't know how to process it, so I didn't. I just let myself go numb. On the 5th day, I heard a knock on the door. It was him. "Hazel," he said, his tone softer than I'd ever heard it. "Can we talk?" My ***T tightened. I wanted to scream at him to go away, but instead I stayed silent, hoping he'd think I wasn't there, but he didn't leave. "I know you're upset," he continued, "but we need to move past this. We're all we have now." His words felt like a slap. "We move past this." I felt my stomach churn. But before I could let the anger take over, doubt crept in. What if he was right? My mom was gone, and it really was just the of us. What if I was overreacting? What if I had done something to cause this? The questions swirled in my head, twisting the knife of guilt deeper and deeper. Eventually I let him in. I couldn't avoid him forever, and part of me was desperate for answers, for some explanation that would make this all make sense. He sat on the edge of my bed, his face full of an emotion I couldn't quite place. Was it guilt? Sadness? Something else? "I'm sorry if I hurt you," he said, reaching for my hand. I pulled away instinctively, and his expression darkened for a moment before softening again. "You're so much like your mom," he whispered. "Sometimes I forget I just miss her so much." He used her as a shield, weaving her memory into his words like a weapon. "I shouldn't have done what I did," he continued. "But it's hard, being alone. You remind me of her so much, and I don't know. Maybe I got confused. It won't happen again," but it did not, even the weeks later. By then, he had started to shift the narrative, painting himself as a victim of grief and loneliness. He stopped knocking and instead came into my room uninvited, sitting on the bed and trying to act as though nothing had changed. He'd bring up mundane things, school dinner plans, chores. It was like he was trying to remind me that we were still a family, that life hadn't been upended. But every time he looked at me, I felt it, that weight, that expectation, like he was waiting for me to make it okay again. The second time was less shocking but no less painful. It was a Friday night, and we had just finished eating. I was clearing the dishes when he came up behind me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Let's watch a movie," he said. His tone was casual, almost cheerful, but something about it made my skin crawl. I wanted to say no, to come up with an excuse to escape to my room, but the words got caught in my throat. So I followed him to the living room, telling myself it was fine, that he wouldn't try anything, that I could leave if I felt uncomfortable. But then his hand found its way to my leg and the cycle began again. His touches were gentler, this time less rushed, as though he was trying to ease me into this new reality. When it was over, he looked at me with something almost resembling affection and said, "I'll be more careful next time. I'll get protection. I promise." Careful, like this was normal, like this was something we just had to get used to. His words echoed in my mind, twisting my guilt and shame into something even darker. Maybe this was my fault. Maybe I had let this happen. Maybe I owed it to him to keep him from being alone, to give him something he said he needed. The thought made me sick, but it also made me stay silent. In the weeks that followed, I shut down completely. I stopped hanging out with friends, stopped talking to teachers, stopped doing anything that might invite questions. I didn't know how to answer. I buried myself in books and school, work, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the moments I couldn't escape, the quiet nights, the awkward dinners, the times he would look at me a little too long, those moments crushed me. I thought about telling someone, anyone, my best friend, a counselor, even a stranger on the street. But every time I got close, the fear stopped me. What if they didn't believe me? What if they blamed me? What if it tore apart what little family I had left? The questions were endless and the answers felt too risky, so I stayed quiet. I told myself it was better this way, that I could handle it, that I had to. Weeks turned into months and the incidents with my dad became less shocking, though no less painful. They happened sporadically, sometimes weeks apart, as if he was testing the waters of how far he could go without breaking me completely. I began rationalizing it, telling myself that maybe this was just how grief had broken him. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it felt. After all, he always apologized afterward, his words dripping with guilt and promises to do better. He swore he loved me, that I was the only thing keeping him going. It was twisted, but in the absence of anyone else. I started believing him. That belief didn't erase the disgust I felt every time he touched me. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight back. But as time went on, those urges dulled, replaced by a numb acceptance. I told myself it was easier this way, that fighting would only make it worse, and on some dark level, a part of me clung to the attention. It wasn't love, not really, but it was something, a connection, a warped, horrible kind of comfort that made the loneliness hurt a little less. Then Lucas Moss entered the picture. She was bubbly, full of energy, and had the kind of laugh that could light up a room. When my dad introduced her as his girlfriend, I felt a strange mix of relief and jealousy. Relief because I thought maybe this meant he would stop, that he would shift his focus to her and leave me alone. But jealousy crept in too, a sick, shameful feeling I couldn't fully understand. Was it jealousy of her, of the idea that she could give him something I couldn't? Or was it anger that he could pretend to be normal with her while I was drowning in the mess he had created? For a few months things were quiet. The nights when he would S into my room stopped, and I started to feel like I could breathe again. I threw myself into school, trying to rebuild some semblance of a life, but that fragile piece shattered. One night when I came home early from a study group, I walked into the living room to find Lucas sitting far too close to me on the couch, her hand on my thigh while my dad watched. "You're so beautiful," she said. Her voice sweetened, syrupy. My stomach churned. My dad didn't stop her. If anything, he seemed to encourage it. That night, the boundaries I thought had been re-established were obliterated. Lucas joined him in the abuse, her presence making it feel even more surreal. She smiled and whispered reassurances that I didn't want to hear, her touch just as unwelcome as his. I felt like I was drowning all over again. The betrayal hit harder this time because it wasn't just him. It was her too, and the worst part, he didn't see anything wrong with it. "It's just us," he said afterward, brushing a tear from my cheek. "No one else can understand. We're family. We take care of each other." One night I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted him, my voice shaking with anger and desperation. "I don't want to do this anymore. I said, my words rushing out before I could lose my nerve, and I don't want her here. She's making it worse. He looked stunned for a moment, then hurt, as if I just accused him of some great injustice. You're jealous, he said softly. You don't want to share me. I'm not jealous, I shouted, my voice breaking. I just wanted to stop. To my surprise, he listened a week later. Lucas was gone. I ended it. He told me, his tone gentle, almost proud. I couldn't stand the thought of making you unhappy. His words were a twisted kind of validation, proof that I still held some control over my life, even as everything else felt like it was sping away. But the relief didn't last without Lucas. The focus shifted back to me entirely. His touches became more frequent, his justifications more convoluted. We're closer than most families, he said one night, his hand brushing against my back. People wouldn't understand, but that's okay. We don't need anyone else. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that what he was doing was wrong, that I wasn't some replacement for my mom, but the words stayed trapped in my throat, weighed down by fear and guilt. I felt trapped like a bird in a cage with no door, only walls that grew tighter and tighter around me. Out of it, the more I tried to make sense of it, the less sense it made. The disgust and confusion never went away, but they became part of the background noise of my life, blending into the routine. I stopped questioning it because questioning it meant facing the full weight of what was happening, and I wasn't sure I could survive. That university was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to leave behind everything that had happened and find myself again. I'd fought hard to stay close to home. My dad insisted on it, but even a short distance felt like freedom. The campus buzzed with energy, filled with new faces, endless possibilities, and the hope of a life that wasn't defined by the walls of my house. I threw myself into my classes, taking every opportunity to lose myself in textbooks and lectures. The routine helped. It kept me distracted, gave me something to focus on besides the mess I'd left behind. But even in the middle of crowded lecture halls and noisy study sessions, the weight of my secret followed me. I'd catch myself flinching at casual touches or shrinking away from friendly smiles, afraid of letting anyone get too close. Trust felt like a foreign concept when I wasn't sure I'd ever understand again. And then I met Samara Gillespie. We were assigned to the same group for a history project. She was everything. I wasn't confident, funny, and so effortlessly kind that it almost hurt to be around her. I'd noticed her before, laughing with friends in the cafeteria or answering questions in class with this ease that made it seem like the world couldn't touch her. She was the kind of person who lit up a room without even trying. At first I kept my distance. It was safer that way, but Samara didn't let me. She had a way of pulling people in, of making you feel like you matter just by looking at you. Hazel, right? She said one day after class, flashing a smile that made my heart skip. We're in the same group, want to grab coffee and brainstorm. Coffee turned in the hours of talking. The project barely came up as we swapped stories about our lives, hers full of adventures and big dreams. Mine carefully edited to leave out the parts one couldn't bear to say out loud. She told me about her family, her love of photography, and her plans to travel the world. Someday I told her about my mom, about how I loved to read, about how university felt like a lifeline I was desperately clinging to. Over the next few weeks, we started spending more time together. It wasn't intentional, at least not at first. She'd ask me to join her for lunch, or invite me to study sessions that turned into late-night conversations. Being around her felt different. It was like stepping into the sun after years of living in the shadows for the first time and forever. I felt seen, and it terrified me. I wanted to tell her everything, to let her in on the parts of my life I'd hidden from everyone else, but every time I thought about it, my T tightened. How could I explain the things I'd done? The things I'd let happen? What if she looked at me differently, or worse? What if she pitied me? So I kept the walls up, even as I felt them cracking bit by bit every time she smiled at me. One evening Samara invited me to her dorm to watch a movie. It was simple, casual, but it felt monumental. We sat side by side on her bed, a bowl of popcorn between us, and laughed at the ridiculous of the film. At 2 points our hands brushed, and I felt my whole body tense. She noticed. Of course she noticed everything, but instead of pulling away, she gently placed her hand over mine and said, "You're safe here." Her words hit me like a tidal wave. I wanted to believe her, to let myself fall into the safety she was offering, but I couldn't. The fear was too loud, too overwhelming. I excused myself to the bathroom where I stared at my reflection, tears streaming down my face. I wanted so badly to be normal, to be someone who could take her hand and not feel like the weight of the world was crushing me. The next morning I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, torn between the worlds. The part of me that craved connection, that wanted to be with Samara, couldn't coexist with the part of me still tied to my father's control. I had to put an end to it. That evening I sat down with my dad for the first real conversation we'd had in months. My hands were trembling, my throat dry, but I forced the words out. "Dad, it has to stop. I can't. We can't do this anymore." His face twisted, a mix of shock and something that looked like betrayal. "Hazel," he started, his voice low, almost pleading. "You don't mean that we're all we have?" "You know that I do mean it," I said, my voice gaining strength with each word. "This isn't normal, it's not okay. I can't live like this anymore." For a moment he looked like he might argue, but then he nodded, his expression unreadable. "If that's what you want," he said quietly, "I'll stop." I wanted to believe him, but a part of me knew better. Promises like his were fragile, easily broken. But for now it was enough to give me hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to be free. Days turned into weeks, and though my dad promised to stop, his presence still loomed like a shadow over every part of my life. Every time he looked at me, spoke to me, or even walked past my room, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. I wanted to believe him. I really did, but trust felt impossible. His promises had been broken before. Why would this time be any different? Meanwhile, Samara continued to be my lifeline. She had this way of making me feel like I could breathe again, even on the hardest days. One evening, as we sat on the grass outside her dorm watching the sunset, she asked me a question that made my heart stop. "Night, do you ever feel like you're carrying something too heavy to hold onto alone?" She said, her voice soft but piercing. I hesitated, my hands gripping the blades of grass beneath me. I wanted to tell her everything. The words were on the tip of my tongue. But every time I tried to let them out, fear choked me. What if she looked at me differently? What if she hated me worse? What if she reported it and my dad ended up in jail? I couldn't bear that, no matter what he'd done. Sometimes I finally replied, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't push. She just nodded and placed her hand over mine, silently telling me she was there whenever I was ready. That night I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying the conversation in my head. I wanted to believe that Samara would understand. But how could I explain something so twisted, so far from anything she could imagine? Then one night everything shattered. It was late, well past midnight, when I woke up to the sound of my door creaking open. My heart sank as I saw my dad standing there, his silhouette framed by the faint hallway light. "I just need to talk," he said, his voice strained, but as he stepped closer, I saw the look in his eyes and I knew it wasn't true. He wasn't here to talk. "No," I said, my voice firmer than I thought possible. "You promised." He didn't stop. His movements were rougher this time, more desperate, like he knew this might be his last chance. I fought back, pushing against him with every ounce of strength I had, but it only seemed to make him angrier when it was over. I lay there, trembling, tears streaming down my face. Something inside me broke that night, the small, fragile part of me that had still hoped things could change as soon as he left the room. I made my decision. I couldn't stay here, not another night. I started packing as the sun began to rise. My hand shook as I stuffed clothes into a bag, my heart racing with fear and adrenaline. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, felt magnified, like the house itself was warning him of my plans. I knew he'd be leaving for his usual Sunday morning grocery run, and as soon as I heard the door close behind him, I bolted. The walk to the train station felt like a lifetime. Every step I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him coming after me. When I finally boarded the train, I collapsed into a seat, tears streaming down my face. I didn't stop crying until I reached Samara's dorm. When she opened the door, her expression shifted from surprise to concern in an instant. "What happened?" she asked, pulling me inside. I couldn't speak. I just fell into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. She held me, whispering words of comfort I could barely hear over the sound of my own tears. For the first time in years, I felt safe. To anyone watching this, who feels trapped, who feels like they have no way out, please know that it's not your fault. What happened to me wasn't my fault, And if it's happening to you, it's not yours either. There are people who care, who want to help, who will believe you. I'm still figuring out how to heal, but the first step was leaving. The second step is telling my story. Maybe it's too late to save the girl I was, but it's not too late to help someone else. My story ends here. If you feel that this story is meaningful and brings useful lessons, please like and subscribe to the channel.